Welcome back guys, this is Ashwin. In this video we are going to see about functions in Python. Generally we use functions for code reusability and to perform a certain task. So that will be code reuse and to perform certain task. Now let's define the function right away. To define a function we need to use the keyword def. So this is the syntax for defining the function. After that we need to give a name for our function. I will give name as welcome and we need to create brackets. In the brackets we can also pass some arguments if you want. By default you don't need to pass any arguments. After defining the functions we need to type the list of statements that need to execute when the function is called. So I'll print welcome to hackersrealm. Now when the function is called it will print welcome to hackersrealm. We'll run the code. Now it didn't print anything. So to call the function we need to call it with the function name. That will be welcome. Let's run it. Now it displays the list of statements, that is welcome to hackersrealm. So this is the basic syntax for our function. Let's define another function with arguments def add a comma b. A and b are the arguments. Now this add function will add a and b and return the sum. So we will return a plus b. Run it. Now call the function add. Let's call it without any arguments. Now it's saying missing 2 required potential arguments. That is, this is the required arguments. If you want to run this function means we need to pass the arguments. Well, let's pass the arguments now. Add 3 comma 5. 3 is passed to A and 5 is passed to B. Now let's run it. Now it returned 8. Now let's see about default arguments. Just copy the same function and paste it. Default argument means when the user didn't pass the argument value, the function automatically takes the default value. So for this I will assign b to 10 and let's run it. Now let's call the function add and let's pass the value only for a. So this function requires 2 arguments, but we are going to pass only 1 argument, that is for a only. For b value it will take the default value as 10. Let's run it. Now it displayed 15 because b takes the default value. If we pass the argument means 5 plus 3, it will take the actual value instead of taking the default value. This default arguments will be useful in many cases, so be sure to remember that. Let's change back. Let's leave some space also. Now another type of arguments is variable length arguments. Now in this variable length arguments, the programmer doesn't know the number of arguments the user gonna provide. So to handle the situation, we will use the variable length arguments. Let's define the same function add with a variable length argument that will be asterisk num. This variable will hold multiple values as a list. And we will initialize a variable for sum is equals 0 and we will iterate each value from the variable, that will be for I in num. We will add it to the sum. Finally return the sum. We can also directly use the sum function here. For clear understanding I am just expanding the code. Run the function. Now let's pass multiple arguments to the function. Add, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 15 So I am passing 6 arguments to the function. Let's run it. Now the function summed all the values and returned the sum. Let's print the num variable. Print num, run it, and again run it. See the num variable returning a tuple. If you want to change the num value, means you can convert it as list and modify it if you want. Otherwise you can just treat it as a tuple for just accessing purpose. That's it for variable length arguments. And now we are going to see about pass by value and pass by reference. First we will see pass by value. Pass by value. Let's define a temporary function, def temp. Let's pass a variable a. We will try to change the variable a equals 5 and we will print it. Now this is the whole function. Now in the main program we will define another variable a equals 10. Now pass the value a to the function temp of a, run it. Now in this function I am just passing the value 10 using the variable a, and a is changed inside the function and I printed it, so that is 5. But I defined a outside the function too. Let's print the a, run it. See, it didn't change. A is still there. I'm just passing only the value to the function, not the entire variable. So that is pass by value. So pass by value generally won't affect the original variable. Won't affect original variable. Okay, next, pass by reference. Now let's define another function, maybe def temp l. I'm gonna pass a list to the argument. Now in the list I'm gonna add another element, that will be 5, and print the list. Now create a new list outside the function L1 equals just 1, 2, 3. Now I'm going to pass this list to the function temp of L1. Now let's run the code. Okay, I passed the list to the function. It appended 5 to the list and I printed it. Now let's see whether the original list is also changed. Print L1. See, the original list is also changed because the function just using this variable as a reference. So in Python, if you pass a list to a function, means it's going to operate with the original values itself. So it affects the original also, the variable also. So if you want to copy the list, you can use the copy function. It will just copy the list to another variable. That will be very useful for you in some cases. Be sure to remember, if you pass a list, it will be passed only by reference. So if anything is changed to the list, that will be reflected back to the original variable. Here the original variable is L1. And next we are going to see about anonymous function. And now we are going to use Lambda keyword. Now let's define a name for a function. Let's say add equals Lambda a comma b. These are the arguments in the anonymous function. So the keyword is completely different. So just observe it. Lambda is used to define the anonymous function, and these are the arguments. And with the arguments we are going to add the two variables, that will be a plus b. So let's define it by running. Now the anonymous function is defined. Now let's call the function with two values, add 5, 10. Run it. See, it displayed 15. similar to the normal function, it just passes the values and these values are operated here. Generally, anonymous function is used to define it in a single line. If the function has multiple statements means you need to go for the default one. Now let's use the lambda function to square the variables in a list. So I'll use this L1 list. Now print list of map, and I'm going to define the function here, lambda x colon x square 2. So this is the function, and I'm going to pass a list. Okay, I'll explain the whole statement here. For the arguments, I'm going to pass the list. Map function is used to pass each value to the function. So each number from the list, it will be passed to the anonymous function. So in the anonymous function, for the value x, it will square the value and keep it in the list. And finally, I'm going to print the list. Let's run it. See, initially the list has 1, 2, 3 and 5. After squaring each number, it's squared to 1, 4, 9 and 25. Like this, we can use this anonymous functions in many cases. And next, we are going to see about scope of variables. Scope of variables. We have two types of variables. One is local variable and the other one is global variable. So let's define a variable counter equals 0 and define a function increment. Now in the increment, I'm going to create a local variable that will be temp equals 0, and I'm going to try to access the variable outside the function, that will be counter plus 1, and I will increment temp also. Now print both temp and counter. Define the function. Now let's call the function. If I call increment, both variables should be incremented by 1 and print it. Let's call it inc and run. See, local variable counter reference before assignment. The counter is assigned before the function itself, so we can't access the variable counter. So to use the counter as a global variable, we need to define the keyword called global counter. So after using the keyword, we can access the variable counter that is defined outside the function, and we can increment it. Here in this function, temp is a local variable that we are created inside the function, and counter is a global variable. Okay, let's run it. Here counter is incremented by 1. Now let's call the function again. See, the counter variable is incremented by 2 because it is a global variable. Each time you call the function, the previous value remains the same. Make sure to understand the difference between local and global variable. So I will type here, this is local and this will be global. Now finally, we are going to see about return keyword in function. So we will define a swap function, def swap a comma b. Now we need to swap the variables and return these two variables. Okay, we can do the swap in one line, b comma a, and return a comma b. So this is the swap function. Instead of doing this operation, we can directly return b comma a. Well, let's run it. Now let's define the variables. A equals 5, b equals 10. Now we need to call the function. So a comma b equals swap of a comma b. Now after calling the function, we are passing two values, that is 5 comma 10, and it will swap the variables. This is just a local variable. Only the values are considered. So after swapping, we are returning two values. Most of the other programming language don't support returning multiple values, but in Python we can return multiple values. The two values will be stored in a comma b. Now let's print a comma b. Run it. Now it printed 10 comma 5. Both the values are swapped and we printed it. Like that we can return any data type like string, list, or dictionary, etc. And we can make use of this multiple returns in many cases, so be sure to remember that. That's it for functions. So if this video is helpful to you, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe the channel for future videos. Stay tuned for the next videos, guys.